Okay, before we start, feel free to participate in our polls down at the bottom of the screen. If you have any questions during the presentation, please ask them. We will have a question pod off to the side of the presentation that you're welcome to type your questions in, and we'll make sure they get answered at some point during the presentation. Today, we will be pleased to hear from Kathryn Grant. She will be giving a presentation titled Understanding the Data in Family Tree. Also, as a note, our next webinar will be Thursday, August 10th, New Developments in the Family History Guide, and that will be with Bob Taylor at 6 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. After years on the sidelines, our presenter, Kathryn, started doing family history and discovered, somewhat to her surprise, that she loved it. Her specialty is mentoring new family historians and helping them find success, and maybe even avoid some of the mistakes she's made. Kathryn teaches Sunday classes at the BYU Family History Library. She also presents at Riverton Saturday seminars and other family history events. Her column on family history ran in the Nauvoo Times for about a year and is still available online. Kathryn works for the LDS Church as a technical writer with a focus on usability and process improvement. Besides family history, she loves uplifting music, thought-provoking books, and spring lilacs. Kathryn, we'll go ahead and turn the time over to you.
Great. Sean, thank you so much. Hey, everybody, while I'm getting this set up, just want to tell you how much I appreciate you joining us today. We've got a really exciting webinar. It's actually one of my favorite topics. So we are set to go. And the reason this is one of my favorite topics is that it has such broad far-reaching effects for all of us in the family history that we do and also in the temple work that we do. So let's go ahead and look at what we're going to be covering today in our webinar. First of all, we're going to talk about the purpose of Family Tree, and there's some interesting background about Family Tree that isn't very well known, and I hope that you'll find that intriguing and helpful. Next, we're going to talk about where the data in Family Tree actually comes from. After that, we're going to look at 4 common misconceptions and kind of why they're misconceptions and also what the facts are. And then finally, we're going to take a fun look at some clues on family tree records that will help you identify where the data came from and how trustworthy it is. So let's go ahead and dive in. So what is the purpose of Family Tree? And Family Tree, just to be clear on that, a lot of times people ask me what the difference is between Family Search and Family Tree. Family Search is the whole website, and Family Tree is that part of the website where we enter information about our family and also where we can reserve and manage temple work. So in order to understand the purpose of Family Tree, I want to invite you to come back in time with me and meet a brother by the name of Harry Russell. Harry Russell joined the LDS Church in 1912, and almost from the beginning of his conversion, he had a great love for family history and temple work that just really captivated him and became an important priority for him. So he had a book, an Abbott family record, and it listed a lot of names of his family. So he went through those names systematically, and he had gone to the temple for a total of 360 days doing temple work for the names in his family record. Then one day he went down to St. George and visited some family there, discovered that they had the same book and they had been doing exactly the same ordinances. So Harry was deeply troubled by this, probably not so much by the fact that people had double ordinances, but rather for all the ordinances that they duplicated, it meant that somebody else didn't get their ordinances done. So Harry started talking to church leaders and thinking about ways that he could solve this problem, and he actually talked with other temple presidents and so forth and learned that they were equally as concerned about this problem of duplication, because remember back in the day, back in the early 1900s, they didn't have access to the internet, let alone personal computers or really any kind of computers. Everything was paper and pencil. Typewriters did come along, but still no electronic communication. So it wasn't really possible for temples to keep in touch with each other and manage duplication on any kind of level. So what Harry did was actually brilliant for that time. He proposed to church leadership that there should be a church-wide clearinghouse for temple ordinances to avoid duplication. Well, if any of you have heard of the TIB, that was Harry Russell's baby, and he actually did refer to it as a baby. He said that bringing it forth it resulted in the same type of labor pains that a human baby might have. So this clearinghouse, the Temple Index Bureau, actually became this giant card file of all temple ordinances performed. If any of you remember the old days when you'd walk into, for instance, the Harold B. Lee Library, and there was that huge card catalog on the main floor, it's that, and maybe in grade school you might remember card catalogs. That was exactly the kind of thing that they had for all the temple ordinances in Salt Lake, except it was many times bigger because it was holding millions of ordinances, cards on millions of ordinances. So every time now, after this clearinghouse was established, then members were instructed that whenever they wanted to clear a name for temple work, they had to send it into Salt Lake City. And I actually remember my mom doing this. She would snail mail her temple submission into Salt Lake City, and then maybe after a few months, it did take a while, she'd get a reply telling her whether the name was cleared for temple work or not. Well, what would happen in Salt Lake is when they got that request, the workers there would take the name and they'd look in this huge TIB filing cabinet and try to determine whether the work had already been done for this person. And as you can imagine, looking through all those cards, that was kind of an error-prone process, but it was just a huge improvement over what had been happening, which was no control of duplication. So this was a fantastic step in the right direction as far as avoiding duplicate work and helping members fulfill their responsibility to redeem their kindred dead. TIB, we could say, is the ancestor of family tree because this data that was gathered on all these index cards eventually ended up in family tree. So let's fast forward now to the 21st century and talk about the purpose of family tree. We've looked at the purpose of the TIB, which was essentially to manage duplication of temple ordinances. Family tree does still have that purpose, but it's actually gone a little bit beyond that. So when we look at the broad purpose of family tree, probably you will remember President Eyring's wonderful conference talk this past April conference on gathering the family of God. So we could say one way to look at it is that the purpose of family tree is to help us gather the family of God, to bind our families to each other, and to help them come safely to the temple regardless of which side of the veil that they're on. So that is the wide, beautiful purpose of family tree. But of course, in order to fulfill a purpose, you have to drill down and set some specific goals. So let's look at what we could say the goal is of family tree. That is to have one complete, accurate record for each person who has ever lived on the earth, linked to other records by correct relationships. So this is essentially how we're going to fulfill that purpose of gathering God's family into the temple. So there's a couple of things that are important to understand then about how family tree works in order to fulfill this purpose. And these things are crucial to understanding how the data is managed in family tree. So family tree is a shared tree, and this is actually somewhat of a revolutionary concept. I mean, we're getting more used to it now that we've had a shared tree since 2012, but still, this is kind of unique. I'm aware of maybe one other website that has ever tried to do a world shared tree, and other than that, most websites will allow you to maintain separate trees. So, for instance, for those of you who might have an Ancestry account or a MyHeritage account, and you've uploaded a tree or created a tree there, you know that those trees are completely under your control. So you upload the information or add the information. You determine what's in your tree, what isn't. You can add, delete, modify. If you want someone not to see your tree, you can block it from people or you can share it with the world. You basically have complete control over that tree in a commercial on a commercial website such as Ancestry or MyHeritage. But that model wouldn't work for Family Tree. One of the main reasons is because it manages temple work. So you can imagine how confusing that would be if everybody had their own separate tree and yet we were all trying to manage temple work and avoid duplication. So Family Tree has to be a shared tree in order for it to meet its goals. That means there isn't any my tree or your tree. We're all working on one common tree. So users might see different parts of the tree, but it's all one tree. Another thing that's so important to understand about Family Tree is that it's open edit. So we mentioned that if you have your own personal tree on Ancestry or MyHeritage or wherever, you really do control the data. And like we said, there's advantages to that. There's a time and a place for where you need to control your own family history data. But for a common tree that's managing temple work, I think Family Search made absolutely the only right decision that could have been made, and that was an open edit tree. Now, in case you're asking, gosh, what on earth is open edit? If you've ever used Wikipedia, you're familiar with the concept of open edit. And basically, it means that any registered user can make changes to the whatever the data is. So in Wikipedia, any registered user can edit an article. In Family Tree, any registered user can edit any person in Family Tree, any deceased person in Family Tree. Living are restricted. But let's just deal with deceased people for the purposes of this presentation. And anybody who's a registered user can edit. So sometimes people are concerned about that. They say, what about data quality and why doesn't Family Tree lock the records or so forth? And they actually do lock records of some famous people, but for the most part, anybody can change anything. To realize how brilliant that is, we just have to look back to New Family Search. If I was in a classroom right now, I'd ask for a show of hands of how many of you used New Family Search, which is now actually discontinued. It's kind of the old New Family Search or just old Family Search. But anyway, if you remember in that system, whenever we couldn't correct anything. So if a record had bad information on it, the best you could do is add what New Family Search considered another opinion. So for instance, you might open up a record and if 20 people thought that the birth date was wrong, there could be 20 different birth dates on that record, and you would just see them all stacked there, all 20 of them. But the trouble was there was no way to tell which one was really right just by looking at that huge list, and it was actually overwhelming for a lot of people. You'd get in there and see, 20 birth dates and 5 different names and 3 different sets of parents, and it just, if any of you remember Ron Tanner's presentations from that time, he used to show this messy fridge and that just had all kinds of ugly, moldy leftovers in it and junk and whatever. And he compared the data in New Family Search to that messy fridge just because we could never clean it up. So having a place where we can clean things up in an open edit system was just a huge step forward in getting a record that is accurate and that people can make sense of. So the open edit system really is powerful. It kind of is a two-edged sword, and probably many of you who are on this webinar now or who are watching it later, you are very well aware that it can be a two-edged sword because, yeah, people can get in and they can make mistakes. They can mess data up. And that is why it is so important that we, oops, got a little ahead of myself there. Let me go back. Why it's so important that all the data that we enter should be supported by sources. So it should have some evidence that it's right. It shouldn't just be, I'm going off my memory, but I don't really know, or it shouldn't be, this is family tradition, but nobody really knows for sure. I mean, if the best we can do, let me take that back. If the best we can do is a family tradition, at least that's a start. But we want accurate sources whenever possible. And when a source is questionable, we want to at least note that. And again, all of this is moving towards the goal of having an accurate record in family tree for every person who's ever lived on the earth. So, that being said, let's dive a little bit deeper into where the data in family tree actually comes from. So there are three main sources, and these sources can actually be broken down a bit more, but for simplicity, we're just going to kind of put them in three buckets today. So the first bucket, as we saw from Dear Brother Russell's attempt or very successful attempt to get the data all in one place, the first source of information for the data in family tree was actually records of completed temple work. And that includes extracted vital records. For those of you who have done indexing, extraction, the extraction program was kind of the forerunner of the indexing program. And in extraction, what would happen is volunteers throughout the church would look at microfilms, and they would actually write down the information from the microfilms, and then that information would be sent to the temples. And when you as a patron went to the temple, if you didn't have your own family name, you got an extracted name that had been prepared by these volunteers. Now that is actually not happening anymore. I've been told by Family Search that just with very rare exceptions, now indexed index data is not provided to temples for temple names. So, but in the old days it was, and so that was one major source of the records in family tree was records of completed temple work. Now also another source is records of LDS church membership. And so I got an example of this firsthand when my uncle passed away. When he died, his ward clerk marked him deceased in the church database, and then not too long after that, his records showed up in family tree because he had been marked deceased. So information from LDS church membership records also is fed into family tree. And then finally, user submissions comprise a very large percentage of the data and growing in family trees. So user submissions include things like uploaded GEDCOM files, four-generation program submissions. For those of you who might remember, in the last century, we were asked by the prophet to submit our four generations to Salt Lake, and then that information, that was basically done on paper. And so I have a photograph of the dear sisters who digitized that information, and in my opinion, they deserve celestial glory. Can you imagine typing all those hundreds of thousands of family group sheets which came in to Salt Lake, and getting those all prepared and digitized so that they could be put in the church's database? They just did us all a huge, huge service. So that's basically where the data in family tree came from or comes from. So let's look at what the implications are of where this data comes from. So, I forgot. You know what? First of all, I wanted to show you when we talk about things coming from extraction or talk about things coming from a four-generation program, for those of you who might not have experienced that, you might hear that and go, I seriously have no idea what you're talking about. So I wanted to just illustrate it a little bit. Here at the top of the screen, you see a parish register from England. And so what would happen in the name extraction program is that the people doing the extraction, the volunteers, would look at something like this on a microfilm reader. And then in the early days, they would actually handwrite the information onto a card, and then that card at some point would be entered into the computer and become part of the church's record, part of their family history database. So that was, and then later on, actually, volunteers were able to enter the information directly into the computer. But that's basically what we're talking about when we speak of extraction. And you can see that that is essentially the same thing as the indexing program. It was just kind of a predecessor of that program. So when we talk about the 4-generation program, what are we talking about? So here is a sample 4-generation submission, and these were just done by members of the church who were responding in faith to the prophet's call and doing the best they could to gather their 4-generation information on pedigree sheets, family group sheets, excuse me, and send that into Salt Lake. So as you can see by looking at this, it's not too complete, but remember that these people were doing it in a day when they might not have had a typewriter. They certainly didn't have a computer most of the time, and they probably had a hard time getting information on their family. So they did the best they could, sent this into Salt Lake, and then all of this information was digitized and it was added into the predecessors of Family Tree and eventually ended up in Family Tree. So this kind of gives you an idea. You know, sometimes we look at that screen in Family Tree and it's all nicely typewritten and it's in this beautiful user interface. And so we don't really know the background of the data. We don't imagine that, gosh, one day, you know, it was in the form of this handwritten 4-generation sheet and now it just is typewritten, but the quality of the data may not be quite what we had imagined it was. So getting back to what does it mean for us? What are the implications of where all this data came from? Well, first of all, it means that the data in Family Tree was ultimately contributed by users just like you and me. And this actually is one of the misconceptions that the data was all contributed by the church and verified by the church. And that actually isn't the case. And we'll be talking about that more a little later. But for now, it's just important to remember that all the data, essentially all the data in Family Tree, was contributed by users just like you and me. So, that being the case, the quality of the information varies widely. Think back to that pedigree chart, or excuse me, family group sheet that we just looked at. That the quality of that information was somewhat low. It wasn't complete. It was difficult to read. It didn't have sources. And I know, again, please don't take that as a criticism of the person who prepared that sheet, because I'm absolutely confident that they did the best they could with what they had. But you can see that the quality of the data in Family Tree does vary widely. We've got everything from submissions by professional genealogists to submissions by the rest of us who are just ordinary people trying to get our family gathered into God's kingdom. So that's something to keep in mind, is the information, since it varies widely, there's an area of caution there. And then also, because we're all collaborating on this joint family tree, duplicate names are an ongoing concern. And again, we're going to be talking about that coming up. So here is a nifty little thing, and I've got to tell you, I almost took this out of the presentation, but I just had a feeling that I shouldn't, that I should leave it in, so here you go. I thought maybe it was just too much information, but it is kind of interesting. So back in the old days, before the days of computer, so that would be computers, it would be in the late 1800s and early 1900s. If you went to the temple and brought a family name to do, the ordinances were recorded on that particular day. And then if you went back another day and did later ordinances for the same person, those ordinances were recorded separately. So the temple workers didn't, and indeed I don't know how they could have, they didn't look back through all the past temple work to see if they could match it up to some previous ordinance. They just recorded the ordinances of the day on the day that they were done. So here's an example of someone in my family tree, John Bescovy. His baptism and confirmation were done on the 2nd of March, 1920, and so one record appeared in Family Tree for him. And I actually think I've merged this by now. So if we went back, we probably wouldn't see this. But at the time when I found it, this is what I saw. I saw that his baptism and confirmation were complete, but it looked like he still needed initiatory endowment. But because of being familiar with my family history, because my grandfather or great great grandfather, like a second or third great grandfather, had done a bunch of this temple work, so I was pretty sure I thought he would not have neglected to do all that work. So that's just really bizarre that I'm seeing that John needs his initiatory and endowment. I don't think he does. And sure enough, as I searched, I found another record for his initiatory and endowment done several months later, the same year. And notice what's weird about this. His baptism and confirmation on this record look like they haven't been done, but they had been. And again, that was a result of the fact that if you went to the temple with your family name, they just recorded the ordinances on that day that you did, and they didn't try to match them without computers. How could they? They didn't try to match them to past ordinances. Or if you did it in separate temples, for instance, there's no way that the temples could coordinate with each other and say, hey, do you have an entry for John Bescabee for his baptism and confirmation? It just didn't happen. So you ended up with these double records in Family Tree. So if you ever do see a record that has later ordinances but doesn't have earlier ordinances, you can be confident that those ordinances were done because they didn't let people just walk into the temple and do the later ordinances without them doing the original, the earlier ordinances first. And this is a particular problem actually in Utah temples in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So if you see these dates and these areas, that is also an indication that you want to look for a duplicate. So that's just a little interesting thing about some data that you might see in Family Tree. Okay, so here is an illustration of potential duplication. And this is actually kind of a conglomerate uh, illustration. It's comprised of a number of different examples that I've seen, but it's actually conservative. And so a lot of times potential duplication that you'll see on older records will be a lot worse than this. But I've simplified it so that I can show you kind of where the duplication came from and why it's happening. So I have a Stuffins family in my Stuffins line, and we're going to use the theoretical example of Anne Stuffins. So imagine that somebody came to the temple back in, 1920, say, and they did her baptism and confirmation. Well, there's one record. Then they did her initiatory on another day. That's another record in Family Tree. Then they did her endowment and sealing, got another record. But then also some volunteer out, say, heck, in California or something, did some extraction and they did her christening record in England. And then someone else did her extracted marriage record. So now she's in here 5 times. Well, then 7 of her descendants did a 4-generation program and sent it to Salt Lake. That was digitized and added to Family Tree. And then later, 2 users, which this is a common problem according to Ron Tanner of Family Search, is that people not understanding that it's a shared tree, that Family Tree is a shared tree, they will intentionally upload duplicates believing that they're uploading, quote, their tree. So you might see extra records from people who have that misunderstanding. So in this little illustration, you can see that there are 14 duplicate records for Anne in Family Tree. And indeed, for many people, there were many others. I've had friends tell me that they had hundreds of duplicates for people who were, for instance, in early church records or maybe early Revolutionary War records or things like that. Their information just got submitted so many times by well-meaning people, not knowing that it had already been done. So all these duplicates ultimately ended up in Family Tree. And I want to make one more comment about that. Um, again, I hope that nothing I say here will ever lead us to be critical of people who submitted all these duplicates. Because again, remember, they didn't have the internet. A lot of them didn't have computers. Up to a certain point, no one did. And then just a small percentage of people did. So the people that did this duplicate work did it with the best of intentions and the best they could using the tools that they had. And the fact is that because they contributed all this data and it ended up in Family Tree, we've got a lot of clues to go on that we might not otherwise have had. So they really did us a great service, and we are in fact standing on the shoulders of giants. And if you can just imagine trying to do the family history that you do now without the internet, without a computer, just think how that would have been. Okay, so let's dive in now to common misconceptions about the data in Family Tree. Why does it matter? Why do we care if there's misconceptions? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that if we understand the misconceptions, we can avoid and correct errors that are in Family Tree. It also helps us to avoid duplicate temple work if we understand these misconceptions. And then finally, it brings us closer to our goal of having a record worthy of all acceptation that will be presented to the Lord. So here are the 4 most common misconceptions that I've run across when I've been working with people on their family history. First of all is the misconception, and we kind of touched on this a little earlier, that Family Tree is the church's official, error-free genealogical record. And you know what? Even though you're all on mute, I do hear somebody laughing. I'm sort of joking a little bit, but really my spirit hears you laughing, because when I say that in classes, people who have dealt with the issues always laugh when I say this. But that being said, for someone who's new to Family Tree and has never heard about where the data came from, this is actually a very logical assumption. And so I like to compare it to the ward directory. So most of our ward directories are pretty trustworthy, right? I mean, people move in, people move out. Sometimes it takes a while for callings to be updated. But on the whole, the ward clerks really do try to make sure that that information is accurate. And so we trust it. We say, okay, this is really the church's, quote, official record of whoever's in my ward. Well, people tended to generalize that to Family Trees, saying, oh, well, this is kind of like a huge ward directory, and the church made it, so the church must have checked everything in this, right? And people just move forward with that assumption, not understanding that it's actually very different from a ward directory and is not an official church record. Next misconception is that the purpose of Family Tree is to provide members with temple names, especially with no more effort on their part than to go in and find a green temple. Next misconception is that Family Tree, because it has a duplicate function, will find all duplicates. And finally, the last misconception is that a green temple icon definitely means that temple work is done, or excuse me, is needed. So I got to look at my own slide here, right? So let's take a look now at each one of those misconceptions and talk about what the facts really are, why those misconceptions are in fact misconceptions. First of all, though, I did want to just emphasize that what all of these misconceptions have in common is that they're all based on a misunderstanding of the data in Family Tree. And that, again, is why it is so helpful and so important to understand where this data came from. It really does have an impact on the family history and the temple work that we do. And if for those of you who may be consultants in your ward or your stake, this will have an impact on how you help other people. So misconception 1, Family Tree is the church's official error-free genealogical record. Well, we won't belabor where the data came from because the first part of the presentation was spent on that. But suffice it to say that Family Tree data was ultimately submitted by users just like you and me and not officially verified by the church. So it's important to remember that the quality varies widely. Second misconception, the purpose of family tree is to provide members with temple names. And unfortunately, this misconception has been promulgated throughout the church by the use of what are sometimes called name finding apps. And I'm not going to mention any names of particular apps because my purpose is not to call anybody out or to criticize anybody. But what happens, in my experience, somebody finds out about a name finding app and they say they run it in Family Tree and it crawls Family Tree and it looks for green temples and it returns maybe 500 or 1,000 green temples to somebody and they say, "Wow, oh my goodness, now I can do temple work for all these people." And they just reserve it and oftentimes they'll share those names with the temple, not realizing the problems with the data, not realizing that they really did need to verify the names first. And then what they do is they go tell somebody else. So they say, "You won't believe what I found out. There's this really cool app called such and such, and I found 1,000 names in 20 minutes, and I'm set for life. I've got all the names I need. I'm taking them to the temple, or I shared them with the temple, or whatever." And so this misconception gets shared again with the best of intentions because people, when they have this misconception and use name finding apps or whatever, really believe that they're doing the right thing and that they're doing a service in moving temple work forward. But let's look at why this is actually a misconception. So the purpose of Family Tree, as we saw, is to manage duplication, and it's to enable a place where we can communicate with other users and build our family tree together, get rid of errors, and come up with that acceptable record that will ultimately be presented to the Lord. So the primary purpose is what I just stated, and it's not to provide temple names without effort. And again, remember that the church doesn't validate the information in Family Tree. So to expect that these are all temple ready names is actually that all the green temples in Family Tree are temple ready is just a misconception. And it turns out that some people say, "Well, gosh, wasn't the church responsible for verifying all this? After all, it is church software." But the truth is, we, the users, are the ones who are responsible for resolving the duplicates and errors in Family Tree. And the important thing to realize is that many, many names are still missing from Family Tree. So here's an interesting little fact. I went to the BYU genealogy. I forget the exact name of it. I think it's called Family History and Genealogy Conference. Anyway, it was just this past July in 2017, and I heard the wonderful Ron Tanner give a presentation. He works for Family Search. He's basically the family tree guy. So he said that as of a few weeks before the conference, there were 1.14 billion names in Family Tree. Now that is amazing, and that is a testament to how hard people are working to get their family in Family Tree, and it's wonderful. But I did some Googling and found out that population experts estimate that since the beginning of time, however they measure that 110 billion people approximately have lived on the earth, which means that if we've got 1.14 billion people in Family Tree, we've got about 109 billion to go. Now, granted, a lot of people who've lived on the earth don't have a record of their life, but the largest in recent years, I should say, I'm actually not sure the percentages, but in recent years, population has grown exponentially. And by recent, I mean the last few centuries compared to the entire 7,000 years of the Earth's temporal existence. And so if we look at all those people who have lived on the earth and we admit and acknowledge that many of them didn't have records of their life, still many, many millions of them do have records of their life. They have birth, marriage, death records, census records, family Bibles, military records, all those different records that would help us have information about them to qualify them for temple work. So it's clear, even without looking at the percentages, that many millions of people could still be added to family tree. So when we assume that all the records are already in family tree, that leads people to ignore the many millions of people and probably billions. I'm guessing that we've got billions who have records that would enable us to add to family tree. If we don't realize we have to add people, then all those people are just left outside and they're not being gathered into the Lord's family. So, misconception number 3, that family tree finds all duplicates. Family tree does find a lot of duplicates, but not all. And let's look at a little bit of why that is the case. Family tree finds possible duplicates by comparing records. So for instance, if records have a lot of common information, if 2 records are very similar, then family tree will flag those records as possible duplicates of each other. Here's an example. So on the left, I've got John Bescobie. He was christened on the 18th of March, 1860 in Lincoln, son of John and Eleanor. Here's a variation on that record in family tree. Got the exact same christening. The location is slightly different. We're missing the shire on the end of Lincoln here, and the mother's name is spelled a little bit different. But those differences are small enough that family tree recognizes that these 2 records are possible duplicates. So when you click possible duplicates, these 2 records will be possible duplicates of each other. So those are slam dunks, and it's wonderful that family tree does find those obvious duplicates. But 2 records might represent the same person and not have very much common information. Here's one example. Here I've got that original christening record for John Bescobie, but over here somebody has added another record to John Bescobie. Or record for John Bescobie. They didn't have his christening, but they knew from the census that he was born about 1858. They were estimating it, and they put down England. I don't know why they didn't add the other information. They may have assumed that England was enough. And they also knew from the census that he was the father of Frederick. So here we've got a name that's in common, but the year is a little bit off. The place is specific here, very broad here, and the identifying relationships are completely different. So even though a person who knows these 2 families, or knows these families, would realize that these are duplicate records, the computer, just by looking at the data, can't make that judgment call. And so when family tree looks to determine if 2 records are duplicate, all family tree has to go by is the information on the record. Now, fortunately, that includes sources. So if you've added sources, that actually helps family tree find duplicates. But in this case, if this is all the information that is on these records and there's no sources, family tree would not identify these people as duplicates, even though I know that they are through research. Here is another example. One record with a woman's maiden name and another one with her married name. So here I've got Millicent Spray. She was christened on this date in this location, and Family Tree has one record for her. I should say had, because I think I've since merged them. But here she is, and then here she is with her married name and being the mother of this son, Frederick. So again, family tree, the system would look at this and say, well, okay, there's a Millicent, but the last names are different, the events are different, the dates are different, the relationships are different, so I'm not going to flag this as a duplicate, says the system. So this is another example of why actually it's not really reasonable to expect family tree to identify all duplicates that a human could find based on research. And research, sadly, in past years has gotten kind of a negative connotation, but I do want to emphasize that when I say research, what I'm really talking about is getting to know that family in the only way that we can. So if we want to get to know people nowadays, what do? We spend time with them. We talk to them on the phone maybe. We send them a text. We email them. We, we interact with them in some way. But for people on the other side of the veil, we typically don't have the opportunity to interact with them, especially on a regular basis. So the best way to get to know them is through the records that they've left behind. Well, we call looking at those records research, but I don't know, that just, I wish there was some better word for it just because research has such a negative connotation for some people. But what it really is, when we look at those historical records and we read about these people's lives, we're getting to know them. We're connecting with our ancestors. So when I say research, I hope you'll take that word in the best possible light. That means that we're looking at these records of our ancestors' lives, and through those records, getting to know them as people and feeling closer to them. So if you want to find duplicates that Family Tree doesn't find, here are some keys to doing that. Know your family. Get to know them through the records that you find about them. Add sources. Add them to Family Tree. And as I mentioned, that's going to help Family Tree identify duplicates. It's also going to help other users. And as funny as this might sound, it's probably going to help you. What I mean by that is sometimes I have attached a source to somebody, and then I've come back several years later to that person, and I look at the record and say, oh my goodness, it's been so long. What was I thinking at the time? And I go through and I see that I attached a source that I'd totally forgotten that I attached. And then I'm able to look at it and say, oh, okay, now I remember, and here's the information about this person. So sources not only help Family Tree and help other users, there's a very good likelihood that they'll help you. And then finally, the most important thing that I would emphasize in finding duplicates is to listen to the spirit. There have been times, there's been more than one time that I have thought that I did a pretty careful job of looking for duplicates, and the spirit has whispered to me, nope, you need to go back and you need to keep looking. And in each of those cases, I have gone back and found the duplicate that the spirit had prompted me was there. And sometimes it took some creative searching, and sometimes it took additional prayers and some real faith and some real effort to try and find that duplicate record. But it was worth it, because then I was able to combine those records, avoid duplicate temple work, and avoid it for somebody else, not just myself, but avoid that and help clean up the tree. So the topic of duplicates is actually a whole huge subject, and we're having a couple of webinars on that later this month. And I forget the exact dates, but if you're interested, go to the BYU webinar page and look those up. I think it might be the 16th, but don't quote me on that. Go ahead and check the webinar page to be sure. But in the meantime, if you're interested, here's a link. This link will be active if you're looking at the Google slide deck. If you're watching the video, it will not be active, but the link won't be active in the video, but there's a link at the end of the video that you can go to get the slide deck. And then you can click on this and see a whole detailed explanation of how you find and resolve duplicates in Family Tree. Okay, let's talk about misconception number 4, that a green temple icon means temple work is definitely needed. To understand why that's a misconception, let's look at the various reasons why a name might have a green temple icon. So one reason is that it's an extracted name that the temple didn't use yet. That was happening a bit more in the early days of New Family Search and Family Tree. I'm actually not seeing it happen so much anymore. Just once in a while, you will see a name that clearly came from the extracted program that doesn't have all the ordinances done. And so that's one possible reason for green temples. One comment about that is I would say probably 90% of the time when I find an extracted record like this that doesn't have temple work, with a very small amount of searching, I'm able to find an extracted duplicate that does have temple work. And you might be saying, well, gosh, why did the church put two extracted records in for the same person? The way it was explained to me by somebody at Family Search is that when the church was microfilming, they sometimes would microfilm sets of records that contained the same thing. For instance, a marriage might be recorded at the county level and at the state level. Well, Family Search didn't and indeed couldn't go back. It didn't have the resources to compare every single county marriage, say for Tennessee, to every single county marriage that was recorded at the state level, or excuse me, every single marriage recorded at the state level for Tennessee also. And so they just microfilmed it, and those records, if they were extracted, were sent to the temple. So that's the explanation for why sometimes you'll see an extracted record that is a duplicate of another extracted record. So if you see them, for sure, look for a duplicate, but if there's not a duplicate, then that person probably still does need temple work. Now, another reason is that someone added the name but chose not to do the temple work. And that does happen. I have a couple of consultant friends who have plenty of their own names. And so when they're researching online, if they find some, say, in-law information that was really hard to find, they'll add that to Family Tree, but they won't do it because it's not technically their blood relative. And so you can sometimes find names in Family Tree that were added and verified, and the person just simply chose not to do the temple work. And in that case, it's valid to do that temple work. But there are times when it's actually not necessarily valid. So that is one of the times is when the record is just flat out a duplicate, as in those several examples that I showed you for Millicent when she had two records, and also for John when he had two records that the system did not identify as a duplicate. And in those cases, the green temple obviously would not indicate that temple work needs to be done on the record that had it. And then also another reason why a green temple might show up, and this is actually becoming more of an issue now that more people are getting in Family Tree, and also that a lot of the old green temples have already been reserved. And that is that somebody added the name and they're actually in the process of reserving it. And I can tell you the experience of my friend who had this happen. She was new to family history at the time, and she had carefully researched this family. She actually had gone so far as to order a certificate so that she could prove, whether the relationships were all right and everything. I think it was a birth certificate. So she got all this family ready, and it was a family with children, and she was so happy, and she was going to give the names to her children to do the baptisms in the temple, and then she and her family would complete the other ordinances. Well, a little bit after she had started preparing these names, she called me and tearfully said, somebody reserved the names that I was working on, and she was just heartbroken. And she actually contacted the person, and they had just been going through and reserving names. I believe, if memory serves, they'd used one of the name finding apps, and they had just gone through and reserved a ton of temple names, including hers, not realizing that she was actually in the process of reserving those names. So that is another reason why a name might have a green temple. But think about it. If you were in the place of my friend and you had added those names and you were getting ready to reserve them, how would you feel? And you'd needed them for your kids to give them a temple experience. Then how would you feel if somebody just came through with an automated program and just took these names with a bunch of others, not being related really closely to the family? And indeed, almost every time that I or my friends have contacted one of these people who have, with the best of intentions, reserved mass green temples, they have no idea how they're related to the person. And they just say, I just ran a name finding app. I don't know how I'm related. And fortunately, in the case of my friend, this person who had done the mass names was willing to give these names back to my friend. So that was good. But in some other cases, people don't know that they can contact the person who did the mass reservation. And so they're just left to not have the privilege of doing the temple work of the people that they had carefully researched. So you might be saying, well, how do I know then if somebody has added a name recently? How do I know if maybe I should let them do this name that they've been working on? Fortunately, on the person page, there is a link called Show All Changes. And if you click that link, you can see when the name was added to Family Tree. And I would just recommend as a courtesy, if you see that that name was added, say in the last few weeks or maybe even the last couple of months, before reserving that name, go ahead and contact the person and just ask them, say, hey, I noticed that you were recently working on this name. Were you planning to reserve it? Or if not, would you like help with it? And that's just kind of a nice courtesy to avoid this problem that more and more people are experiencing of somebody using a name finding app and just coming in and using or reserving the very names that they are working on and planning to reserve. So a couple of other reasons to be careful with green temple icons. Again, as a reminder, the accuracy of the information varies widely, and so information and relationships should always be verified for a green temple. And then also another thing that name finding apps don't usually take into consideration, and often people that are just clicking green temples even without a name finding app forget about, is that the person might have died before age 8. And if they did, that means that they don't need any ordinance except sealing to parents. So to spend that time in the temple doing those ordinances for the person who died before 8 means that that was time that you could have spent, that we could have spent doing those ordinances for somebody else. Okay, so sometimes I've talked with people about this issue and they say, oh, it can't be as bad as you're saying, or yeah, it's just not a big deal. And here are some actual examples. I was going to say something else. In fact, I think I will. There's two issues that we're talking about here, are two kind of ends of the spectrum is a better way to say it. All of us are probably going to do some duplication accidentally. There's just no way to avoid that. And we all make mistakes. We're all human. So if we're trying our best and we do duplication, in my mind, that is just not a big deal. We made a mistake. We learn and move on, right? The thing that I'm talking about is when people are careless about duplication. And I have had people, fortunately very few, but people who just admit they don't care and they say, I just want names for the temple. I really do not want to check them for duplicates. I just don't care about that. And so here are some actual examples from consultant friends of mine who were helping people who had done mass temple reservations of green temples without verification. And when the consultant helped them to check those names, this is what they found. Out of 30 unverified names, only one sealing to parent was needed. Another consultant found that out of 25, 0 ordinances were needed. Out of 100, 0 ordinances were needed. And out of 37, only 2 people needed ordinances. So these are actual examples from consultants that were helping people. And this is just to illustrate the importance of not just reserving green temples without any verification. Because if you do, there's a chance that your statistics will be similar to this. And really today with Family Search historical records and Ancestry, Find My Past, all these wonderful genealogy sites, it is actually pretty easy to verify somebody that you find in Family Tree and make sure that the relationships are right and that the information is correct and that they don't have a duplicate. My friend Heather McPhee, who actually one of those examples was hers, she's a consultant in Idaho, and she always likes to say, think of green temples as an invitation to research. And I love that because that's exactly what they are. The person may need temple work, and we do want to verify that, but if we find a green temple, we don't just want to assume without any verification that temple work is needed. Finally, this is actually one of my favorite little parts of the whole understanding the family tree data thing, and that is clues on family tree records. We actually at the BYU Family History Library have a whole webinar on this topic, so I'm just going to give a brief summary of it, but if you're interested, please do feel free to watch that webinar, and I'll give you the link to that. So why do these clues matter? Why do we even care if we can find clues on family tree records? Well, because they can help indicate how reliable the information is on the record. They can lead to additional information about the person and their family, and they can make it easier to avoid mistakes. So here's an example. If a PID, and the PID is this identifier number, it's sometimes called an ID number or a person number. I like PID just because it's short and easy to say. So PID, if you see a PID that starts with an M or a 9, it was probably created from an extracted record or possibly from a user-contributed record before the days of even New Family Search. If you find a PID that starts with a K, in my experience, most of those are they were created from church membership records, but I also have seen them from extracted records before New Family Search or an early user contributed record in New Family Search. That's what the NFS stands for. So again, in my experience, this isn't a hard and fast rule, that's just what I've observed. Most often they were LDS church membership records, but I have seen them for these other items as well. And then finally, any PID that starts with an L is typically one that was added by a user to Family Tree most of the time now, or to New Family Search in the old days. So they started in New Family Search with Ks and then moved on to Ls. So that's just a brief overview. And why does that matter? Well, if a record starts with an L, then you know that a user contributed it, and you probably are going to be able to contact that user. If the record starts with an M, a 9, or a K, I've never, to my memory, seen that that there was a link for the user that submitted it because it was submitted before Family Tree, so the contact information was not included. However, records that are created in Family Tree they will always tell you who created them. And most of the time, there will be an email in my experience. And if there isn't, you can still use Family Search's messaging system to contact that contributor. So here's an example of if the first 5 or 6 characters of the PID match, as in the case of this William Besceby and his parents, then it's pretty likely that the records were extracted as part of the same group or batch. So why does that matter? Well, as you can imagine, think back to what we explained about the extraction program. When volunteers were given a roll of microfilm and they basically looked at that microfilm and extracted all the people just in order out of that parish or out of that locality. So if you know that if you look at these PIDs and realize that they were all from a batch, that means that you can find the batch and you can see other people that were extracted as part of this batch, which most likely will include other family members for this person. And again, the purpose of this webinar was not to go into detail on how to do that, but the other webinar on this topic does go into detail of how to do that. So if you're interested, check out that other webinar. So here is the fine print about clues. Family Search, and a guy from Family Search was very, very emphatic about this, rightly so. Family Search does not assign certain PIDs to certain types of records. So in other words, they didn't say, oh, here's a bunch of extracted records, let's make them all start with M, or let's make them all start with 9. Family Search doesn't do that. they do assign the computer does assign the records somewhat sequentially. So basically, it's sort of a coincidence that all the extracted records got, or many of the extracted records got M's and 9's. That's just because that's where they were in the sequence of numbers they were using. So Family Search does not assign certain PID numbers to certain types of records, but the fact that they were assigned sequentially will often allow you to deduce what type of record it probably is. I hope that makes sense, and if it doesn't, please put a question in the question pod and we'll address those questions in just a minute or two after we're done with the presentation. So remember, these are clues, not rules. They're not hard and fast rules. And especially merges may affect the clues. So you might see a K that totally doesn't look like a membership record or anything else because it's been merged with a number of other records. So again, use them as clues, use them as something to help you, but don't feel that they're hard and fast and that they're always guaranteed. For more information, there's the link. The webinar is called Hidden Clues on Person Records in Family Tree, and you can find that on the BYU Family History Library webinar page. Finally, I wanted to give you the source for the story that I told about Henry Russell. This is probably one of my all-time favorite books. It is the history of family history. So it starts with the restoration and the visit of Elijah and so forth, and traces the development of family history all the way up until New Family Search. And it is just one of the most inspirational and fascinating reads that I've ever had. This book is available at Deseret Book. If I remember correctly, it's digital. You can get it digitally. I don't have the digital version. I've just got an old hard copy. But Deseret Book for sure has it. And then also, it's in PDF form on the web. If you Google, it originally appeared in BYU Studies. So if you Google Hearts Turn to the Fathers, BYU Studies, and probably these authors here, James Allen, Jesse Embry, and Khalil Mayer, I hope I'm saying his name right. If you Google that, you will probably find the PDFs. I actually found the PDFs a bit awkward to read, but they are free. And so that is another way that you can get this amazing book. So in conclusion, understanding the data in Family Tree helps us avoid and correct errors. It helps us do valid temple work, and it brings us closer to that record worthy of all acceptation. And here's that scripture in the D&C. And I know that this day will come. There will be a day when this record will be presented to the Lord of all of our temple work, our temple ordinances, and our kindred dead. And so I'm just so excited that all of us get to play a part in preparing that book and redeeming our loved ones on both sides of the veil. So that concludes our webinar for today. Here's the link that I promised. This slide deck and others are available at this tiny URL, just fh-resources. And Sean, do we have any questions? Sean, if you're speaking, I can't hear you. I'm just curious if we have any questions to address. Sometimes we have issues with these microphones.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, nope.
Um, it looks like it was still on mute. It doesn't look like we have any questions right now. Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Kathryn, for the presentation. And
You're
we will
welcome.
be posting this onto YouTube right after we finish the presentation. And you guys are welcome to view it again on there if you'd like. Also, it's an easy way to share it with friends and family. Um, and we'll go to the last part of the presentation. If you guys would like to fill out the polls before you exit out, that's also would be helpful. If there's any topics that you'd like to hear in the future, go ahead and let us know, and we'll make sure that we get webinars of those in the future. And then again, A big thanks to Kathryn for that great presentation.